Most people never notice the doors they pass every day. Heavy wooden doors set into old stone buildings. Doors with symbols carved so softly into the surface that the eye slides over them without stopping. Doors that have been closed for centuries, not because they are locked, but because few people ever think to ask what lies behind them. And yet, behind some of these doors, history has been quietly unfolding for over 600 years, leaving traces so subtle that they feel more like whispers and facts. Imagine walking through a city at night. The streets are calm, the lights dimmed, the noise of the day finally settling into a low hum. Somewhere between a church and a library stands a building you have seen 100 times before. Tonight, however, something feels different. There's a symbol above the entrance. Simple, balanced, almost comforting. You cannot explain why, but it feels as though this place has been watching generations pass by, unmoved, patient, waiting. This is often how Freemasonry enters people's lives, not with a revelation, but with a quiet sense that something old is still breathing beneath the surface of the modern world. For centuries, Freemasonry has existed in this strange space between the ordinary and the mysterious. It has been accused of controlling nations and dismissed as a harmless social club. It has been feared, romanticized, banned, misunderstood, and endlessly speculated about. But rarely is it simply listened to. Rarely do we slow down enough to trace its story the way it actually unfolded. Slowly, imperfectly, shaped by human hands rather than hidden masters pulling invisible strings. The truth is quieter than the myths, and in that quietness, it becomes far more interesting. Freemasonry did not announce itself to the world with trumpets or decorations. It emerged gradually, shaped by time, labor, and silence. Its roots stretched back into an era when knowledge was not easily shared, when literacy was rare, and when the skills required to build a world were guarded carefully. To understand Freemasonry is not to uncover a single secret, but to follow a long trail of symbols, customs, and human desires that have been carried forward from one generation to the next. At its heart, Freemasonry is a story about builders, not kings or warriors, but craftsmen, men who worked with stone geometry and patience, men who spent their lives shaping cathedrals that would outlast them, carving symbols into walls they would never see completed. In those days, building was not just a profession. It was a calling. Each measurement carried meaning. Each angle reflected an understanding of harmony and balance. And knowledge, once earned, was protected with care because it was the difference between stability and collapse. As centuries passed, the physical stones gave way to symbolic ones. Tools once used to shape rock began to represent ideas. Morality, discipline, restraint, purpose. The language of building slowly transformed into a language of self-improvement. And still, the tradition remained quiet, not because it was hiding something dangerous, but because silence itself had become part of the teaching. Silence is power. It invites reflection. It slows the mind. It creates space for meaning to settle. Freemasonry learned this early, and it carried that lesson forward even as the world grew louder around it. This silence, however, made others uncomfortable. In times of fear, anything quiet becomes suspicious. When information is withheld, imagination rushes in to fill the gap. And so, over time, Freemasonry became less about what it did and more about what people thought it might be doing. Stories grew. Rumors multiplied. Symbols were taken out of context and transformed into signs of control or prophecy. What was once a method of teaching became, in the public imagination, a veil hiding unimaginable power. Yet the reality remained stubbornly human. Freemasonry did not survive for 600 years because it ruled the world from the shadows. It survived because it adapted. It changed slowly, absorbed new ideas, and reflected the societies it existed within. In some places, it became a space for philosophical discussion. In others, a network of charity and community. And sometimes, it became a symbol of resistance, not because it sought conflict, but because it valued independent thought in eras that feared it. This independence was often mistaken for rebellion. Governments and religious institutions, wary of organizations they did not control, viewed Freemasonry with suspicion. Bans were imposed. Lodges were closed. Members were persecuted. And still, the ideas persisted, carried quietly from person to person, Conversation, long after buildings have been destroyed. What makes this story so enduring is not secrecy, but continuity. Freemasonry is one of the few traditions that has managed to preserve a sense of ritual in a world that constantly sheds it. Ritual slows time. It asks participants to move deliberately, to listen carefully, to consider meaning beyond immediate utility. In an age obsessed with speed and clarity, ritual feels foreign, and anything foreign is easily misunderstood. But perhaps this is why Freemasonry continues to fascinate, not because it offers hidden answers, but because it reminds us that not everything needs to be explained loudly. Some things are meant to be experienced gradually. Some ideas reveal themselves only when approached with patience. As we begin this journey, it helps to let go of the idea that there is a single revelation waiting at the end. There is no final door that opens to expose a grand truth. Instead, there are many small doors, each leading to a deeper understanding of how humans have always searched for meaning through symbols, stories, and shared silence. Tonight, you are not here to uncover conspiracy. You are here to listen. To follow a story that winds through stone halls, candlelit rooms, whispered teachings, and long nights of careful thought. A story shaped by ordinary people who believed that building something lasting required more than strength. It required wisdom. And as the noise of modern life fades and the mind begins to slow, it becomes easy to understand why Freemasonry has endured, not as a force of control, but as a quiet companion to history, walking beside it, leaving marks only for those willing to look closely. The door has always been there. It was never locked. It simply waits for the moment you decide to pause, to notice, and to step closer, not in search of answers, but in appreciation of the long, patient silence that has carried this story through the centuries. Long before the word Freemason was ever spoken, long before lodges, rituals, or symbols were formalized, there was already a deep and almost instinctive human connection between building and meaning. To understand where Freemasonry truly begins, we must step back into a time when history had not yet learned to write itself down clearly, when knowledge moved from hand to hand and mind to mind, carried by memory, practice, and quiet observation. In the earliest human communities, building was not separate from belief. A shelter was never just a shelter. A wall was not only a barrier against wind or animals. Every structure reflected an understanding of the world, of balance, protection, and order. When early humans placed stones in deliberate arrangements, they were doing more than stacking materials. They were making sense of their surroundings, imposing shape on chaos, and creating a small island of stability in an uncertain landscape. As societies grew, this instinct deepened. Stone circles rose from the earth, aligned carefully with the movement of the sun and stars. Temples appeared, their proportions measured with remarkable precision long before modern mathematics existed. These ancient builders understood something intuitively, that geometry was not just a tool, but a language, a way of communicating harmony, power, and reverence without words. The people who possessed this knowledge were not rulers, but craftsmen. They learned through years of observation and repetition. There were no books to consult, no diagrams widely available. What they knew lived in their hands and their eyes. To pass this knowledge on was to entrust someone with a responsibility, not only to build safely, but to preserve a way of understanding the world. And so, teaching became selective. Not everyone could learn everything at once. Skill was earned, not given. This is where the earliest echoes of later traditions can be felt. Knowledge, when hard-won, is protected, not out of greed, but out of respect for its power. A poorly taught technique could mean a collapsed structure. A misunderstood measurement could cost lives. Silence, patience, and gradual instruction became necessities, not mysteries. In ancient civilizations like Egypt and Mesopotamia, builders were held in high regard. They were entrusted with sacred projects, pyramids, ziggurats, temples that touched the sky. These structures were not simply impressive. They were symbolic bridges between the human and the divine. Every angle carried intention. Every measurement reflected cosmic order. The act of building became an act of worship, even if it was never spoken of in those terms. Across cultures, this pattern repeated. In Greece, geometry was studied as a pathway to truth. In Rome, engineering became a symbol of civilization itself. In India and China, architectural manuals blended spirituality with practical instruction. Everywhere humans built, they infused those buildings with meaning beyond their physical form. And always, the builders formed communities among themselves. They shared techniques, guarded secrets of proportion and load-bearing, and developed signs to recognize one another. These were not secret societies, as we imagine them today. They were practical networks formed out of necessity. Travel was dangerous. Trust was rare. A mark, a symbol, or a shared method could mean the difference between acceptance and rejection when arriving in a new place. Over time, these communities develop identities. Not loud ones, but quiet, functional ones. They spoke through tools, through craftsmanship, through the work they left behind. Their legacy was written in stone rather than ink. As centuries passed and civilizations rose and fell, the knowledge of building did not disappear. It migrated. It adapted. It was absorbed into new cultures and reshaped by new beliefs. When the great empires faded, much of this knowledge survived not in palaces, but in the hands of wandering craftsmen who carried their skills wherever work could be found. By the early medieval period, Europe was a patchwork of small kingdoms and fragile institutions. Large-scale construction had nearly vanished, and with it, much of the formal knowledge of stonework. But slowly, as stability returned, the desire to build grand structures reemerged. Cathedrals began to rise from the ruins of earlier eras, reaching upward with a confidence that seemed almost impossible after centuries of decline. Once again, skilled builders were needed, and once again, those builders formed close-knit communities. They traveled from site to site, following commissions that could last decades. They lived together, worked together, and taught one another in temporary shelters built beside construction sites. These shelters, lodges, became spaces of learning, planning, and shared identity. Yet even before these medieval lodges took shape, the mindset that would later define Freemasonry was already present. A respect for order, a belief in gradual improvement, an understanding that knowledge, when treated carelessly, could do more harm than good. These ideas were not invented. They were inherited. What makes this prehistory so important is that it reminds us that Freemasonry did not appear suddenly, nor was it designed with some grand hidden purpose. It grew organically from human needs that existed long before formal institutions. The need to build safely, the need to teach responsibly, the need to belong to something larger than oneself while still maintaining discipline and restraint. In this light, the later use of symbols becomes easier to understand. Symbols are efficient. They carry meaning across time and language. A square suggests fairness. A circle suggests unity. A straight line implies honesty. These interpretations were not invented by Freemasonry. They were recognized long before, drawn from the natural world and human experience. As societies became more complex, symbols allowed builders to communicate ideas quickly and discreetly. A mark carved into stone could identify a craftsman's work. A simple diagram could convey a complex instruction. Over time, these practical symbols took on deeper significance, layered with philosophical meaning, as builders reflected on the nature of their craft. The transition from physical building to symbolic building did not happen overnight. For generations, the two existed side by side. A mason could spend his days shaping stone, and his evenings discussing the moral lessons drawn from his work. Patience, precision, cooperation. These were not abstract concepts. They were lived experiences, reinforced every time a wall stood firm or a structure failed. This blending of labor and reflection laid the groundwork for what would eventually become Freemasonry. But at this stage, there was no name, no formal organization spanning continents. There were only traditions passed quietly from teacher to student, shaped by local customs and needs. And perhaps this is why so much confusion surrounds Freemasonry today. People search for a single origin, a founding moment, a hidden mastermind. But the truth is more subtle. Freemasonry is not the creation of one time or place. It is a slow accumulation of human habits, values, and practices that proved useful enough to survive. As you rest with this idea, it becomes easier to let go of the expectation of revelation. There is no sudden secret waiting to be uncovered. Instead, there's a long, steady rhythm, a pattern of learning, building, and reflecting that has accompanied humanity for thousands of years. Before there were lodges, before there were rituals, before there were whispered rumors and public fears, there were simply people trying to understand how to shape their world without destroying it. They measured twice before cutting once. They learned from failure. They trusted those who proved their skill and their character. In that quiet, patient space, where knowledge was respected and time was allowed to do its work, the foundations were laid, not just for buildings of stone, but for an idea that would one day take symbolic form, carry with the memory of every hand that had ever shaped a block, a line of wall, or pause to consider the meaning of what they were creating. As Europe slowly emerged from centuries of uncertainty, the sound of stone being shaped returned to the landscape. It began quietly, almost hesitantly. A church repaired here, a wall rebuilt there. Then, as confidence grew, something remarkable happened. Towers rose. Arches stretched wider than ever before. Light poured through stained glass and settled onto cold stone floors. The medieval cathedral was born, and with it, the age of the master builder. These immense structures were not the work of a single lifetime. A cathedral could take 50, sometimes 100 years to complete. The men who laid the foundation stones knew they would never see the final spire touch the sky. And yet, they worked with devotion, precision, and patience, guided by plans that existed more in tradition than on parchment. In a world without blueprints as we know them today, knowledge lived in the mind and hands of the mason. Stone was unforgiving. A mistake could not be erased. Once cut, it remained as it was, for better or worse. This demanded a level of discipline that shaped not only buildings, but the people who built them. Apprentices began young, learning first to observe, then to assist, and only much later to shape stone themselves. Years passed before a single strike of the chisel was entrusted to them. And even then, every motion was watched, corrected, refined. The work site was alive from dawn until dusk. The sound of mallets echoed against limestone. Dust hung in the air, catching the light like a pale fog. Ropes creaked as stones were lifted into place. And amid this controlled chaos, there was order. Each man knew his role. Each task flowed into the next, bound by an unspoken understanding that this work mattered, not just for present, but for generations yet unborn. At the edge of these sites stood simple wooden structures, temporary shelters built to house tools, plans, and discussions. These were the lodges. They offered protection from weather, a place to rest, to eat, to teach. But more than that, they were spaces of trust. What was learned inside the lodge was not shared freely outside it, not because it was forbidden, but because it required context, discipline, and responsibility. Within these lodges, knowledge was passed in stages. An apprentice did not learn everything at once. He learned when to listen, when to watch, when to wait. Geometry was taught not as abstract theory, but as a living guide. Proportions were felt as much as calculated. The balance of an arch was understood through experience, not explanation. This method of teaching created a bond between mentor and student that went beyond instruction. It was a shared way of seeing the world. Travel was a defining feature of the mason's life. Work could not come to them. They had to go where it was needed. A mason might spend years moving from one town to another, recognized not by name, but by skill. To ensure trust in unfamiliar places, marks were used. These were personal symbols carved into stone, identifying who had shaped it. Over time, these marks also served as proof of experience, allowing masons to find work without lengthy explanations. This system created a quiet brotherhood that spanned regions and languages. A mason from France could arrive in England and be understood through shared practices. A German builder could work alongside an Italian one, united by geometry and tradition. The lodge was not bound by borders. It was bound by craft. Secrecy, in this context, was practical. Techniques that ensured stability and safety could not be taught casually. A poorly trained builder endangered lives. And so, access to deeper knowledge was earned through years of demonstrated reliability. Silence was not enforced by fear, but by respect. To speak without understanding was worse than saying nothing at all. As cathedrals rose, so did the reputation of the masons who built them. They were no longer seen as mere laborers. They were specialists trusted with sacred spaces and immense resources. This elevated status allowed them a degree of independence rare in medieval society. While most people were tied to land or lord, Masons moved freely, guided by their work rather than by feudal obligation. This freedom, however, came with responsibility. The lodge governed itself. Disputes were settled internally. Standards were enforced by peers. Honor mattered because reputation was everything. A Mason who cut corners or betrayed trust would find doors closing quietly around him. Over time, the language of the craft began to deepen. Tools took on metaphorical meaning. The square was not just a tool for right angles. It became a reminder of fairness and honesty. The level symbolized equality, reminding each Mason that all stones, no matter how ornate, rested on the same foundation. These ideas were not spoken as philosophy, but lived daily through labor. Nightfall brought a different rhythm. As the worksite quieted, the lodge became a place of reflection. Candles flickered against rough wooden walls. Conversations turned from stone to life, from measurements to meaning. It was here, in these quiet moments, that the seeds of symbolic thought were planted. Building a cathedral was more than assembling materials. It was an expression of order imposed on chaos, light drawn from darkness. The Masons knew this, even if they never wrote it down. Their work taught them patience. A cathedral did not respond to urgency. It demanded consistency, humility, and trust in a future one would not witness. This mindset shaped how Masons viewed the world and their place within it. As centuries passed, the techniques refined in these lodges spread widely. The great Gothic structure stood as proof of what disciplined collaboration could achieve. And yet, as construction slowed and styles changed, the world around the Masons began to shift. By the late medieval period, the great age of cathedral building was drawing to a close. Political power centralized. New methods emerged. The need for large traveling bands of stonemasons diminished, but the lodges did not vanish. Instead, they adapted. Some remained focused on craft. Others began to welcome men who were not builders by trade, but thinkers, patrons, and scholars. These men admired the order and symbolism of the Mason's world and saw in it a framework for understanding life itself. Stone was no longer the only thing being shaped. This transition was slow and unremarkable at first. There was no announcement, no turning point. A man might join a lodge not to build a wall, but to participate in discussion, to learn through metaphor what others had learned through stone. The lodge remained a place of quiet instruction, even as its focus began to shift. Looking back, it becomes clear that medieval stonemasons were not consciously creating Freemasonry as it would later be known. They were simply doing what worked, preserving knowledge, teaching carefully, building with intention. The rituals, symbols, and traditions that emerged from this world were byproduct of a life spent balancing precision with patience. In the glow of candlelight, surrounded by tools worn smooth by years of use, the medieval Mason found meaning in repetition, in doing something well, again and again, even when no one was watching. And it is from this mindset, more than from any hidden agenda, that the foundations of Freemasonry were laid, quietly, steadily, one stone at a time. Change rarely announces itself. It does not arrive with sharp edges or clear boundaries. More often, it settles in slowly, almost unnoticed, blending into routines until one day it becomes impossible to say exactly when things became different. This is how the lodge transformed, not through revolution, but through quiet adaptation shaped by time, circumstance, and human curiosity. As the great age of cathedral building faded, the world around the Masons shifted. Cities grew more stable. Power consolidated into governments and institutions. New methods of construction reduced the need for vast traveling bands of stoneworkers. The lodge, once filled with the sounds of chisels and practical instruction, began to feel different. Not empty, but quieter. The urgency that once defined daily labor softened into reflection. Yet the lodge did not disappear. Instead, it found new purpose. Men who were not stonemasons began to take interest in these spaces. They were drawn not to the physical craft, but to the order and symbolism embedded within it. Philosophers, scholars, merchants, and local leaders saw something valuable in the way Masons organized themselves. Here was a system built on merit rather than birth, on discipline rather than privilege. Knowledge was earned, not inherited. This alone was unusual in a world defined by rigid hierarchies. At first, these newcomers were welcomed cautiously. They did not shape stone, but they listened. They learned the language of tools and symbols, understanding that these were not arbitrary signs, but distilled lessons drawn from generations of experience. A square was not merely a shape, it represented fairness. A compass was not just a measurement, it symbolized restraint and balance. These ideas resonated far beyond the building site. Over time, a distinction quietly emerged. There were operative masons who worked with stone and accepted masons who worked with ideas. Both shared the same space. Both respected the same traditions, but their purposes began to diverge. The lodge became a place where physical labor and philosophical discussion coexisted, each informing the other. This coexistence changed the nature of the lodge itself. Meetings were no longer solely about planning construction or teaching technique. They became moments of structured conversation. Discussions of morality, ethics, and personal conduct found a home within the symbolic framework of the craft. The tools on the table became prompts for reflection rather than instruments of labor. Rituals began to take shape, not as performances, but as methods of teaching. In a largely illiterate society, structured experiences communicated lessons more effectively than written words ever could. Movement, repetition, and symbolism allowed complex ideas to be absorbed slowly, intuitively. The lodge became a classroom without books, a space where learning unfolded through experience rather than instruction. What emerged was not secrecy for its own sake, but privacy. These discussions required trust. Ideas could be explored honestly only when participants felt safe from ridicule or punishment. In a time when certain beliefs could invite suspicion, or worse, the lodge offered a rare environment where thought could unfold without immediate consequence. This environment attracted thinkers who valued independence of mind. Scientists, writers, and reformers found in the lodge a place to examine ideas that might be unwelcome elsewhere, not because the lodge pushed a specific agenda, but because it encouraged careful reasoning, self-improvement, and mutual respect. It did not tell members what to think. It taught them how to think. As this shift continued, the physical craft receded further into the background. Fewer members knew how to cut stone. Fewer still needed to, but the symbolic language remained. In fact, it grew more refined. The act of building was reimagined as an inner process. Each person became a rough stone, imperfect and unfinished, capable of improvement through effort and reflection. The lodge, once a shelter beside a construction site, became a symbolic space. Its layout, its objects, even its orientation took on meaning. Entering the lodge was no longer just stepping inside a building. It was stepping into a shared mindset. The outside world, with its noise and hierarchy, was left at the door. Inside, all stood on equal footing, united by the pursuit of personal growth. This transformation was gradual and uneven. In some regions, operative traditions lingered longer. In others, speculative ideas took hold quickly. There was no central authority dictating change. Each lodge evolved according to local needs and influences. This lack of uniformity would later fuel confusion and suspicion, as outsiders struggled to understand what Freemasonry truly was. And yet, beneath these variations, a common thread persisted. The lodge remained a place of order. Meetings followed structure. Roles were defined. Progression was earned. These elements provided stability in a rapidly changing world. As scientific discoveries challenged old beliefs and political systems shifted, the lodge offered continuity. It is important to understand that this evolution was not driven by a desire for power. There is little evidence that early speculative Masons sought control or dominance. Instead, they were responding to uncertainty. The world was changing faster than ever before. Old explanations no longer satisfied. People needed new ways to make sense of their place within society. Freemasonry, in its emerging form, provided a framework without dogma. It offered symbolism without rigid interpretation. Members could draw meaning from shared experiences while still arriving at personal conclusions. This flexibility allowed the tradition to endure even as cultures and beliefs shifted around it. By the early modern period, lodges had become gathering places for men of diverse backgrounds. A noble might sit beside a merchant, a scholar beside a craftsman. This leveling of social distinctions was subtle but significant. Within the lodge, titles mattered less than conduct. Reputation was earned through participation, not inherited status. This egalitarian spirit did not go unnoticed. To those outside the lodge, it could appear threatening. Institutions built on rigid hierarchy viewed such spaces with suspicion. What was being discussed behind closed doors? Why were these men meeting privately? Why did they use symbols instead of plain speech? The answers were often mundane, but imagination thrives in the absence of clarity. As lodges became more symbolic and less visibly tied to physical labor, their purpose became harder to explain. What could be easily understood as a practical necessity in a building yard now seemed enigmatic in a quiet room. Yet for those inside, the meaning was clear. The lodge had become a mirror, a place to examine oneself through metaphor, to consider how one's actions align with one's values, to practice patience, humility, and cooperation in a structured environment. The transformation from operative to speculative masonry was not a rejection of the past, but a continuation of it. The same principles that guided the building of cathedrals now guided the building of character. Precision became integrity. Balance became restraint. Strength became resilience. And through it all, the lodge remained what it had always been at its core, a space apart from the noise of the world, a place where time slowed, where symbols spoke softly, and where progress was measured not in speed, but in depth. What had begun as a practical shelter for tools and plans had quietly become something else entirely. Not a secret society plotting from the shadows, but a reflective one, preserving an old way of learning in a new world. The birth of the lodge, in this sense, was less an origin story and more a moment of recognition, a realization that the act of building had always been about more than stone. Long before words were written down, humans learned to speak through shape, a line drawn in the dirt, a circle traced around a fire, two stones balanced carefully against one another. These simple forms carried meaning long before language gave them names. They told stories about balance and direction, about boundaries and connection. And when Freemasonry began to express its ideas, it reached instinctively for this ancient method of communication. Symbols do something words often cannot. They settle into the mind quietly. They bypass argument and speak directly to intuition. This is why they endure across cultures and centuries, even as spoken languages fade. In the lodge, symbols were never meant to impress or intimidate. They were meant to remind, to gently pull the attention back toward certain values without demanding belief or obedience. Take the square, for instance. In the hands of a builder, it ensures that angles are true and walls stand upright. Without it, structures slowly lean, weaken, and collapse. When lifted out of the physical world and placed into symbolic thought, the square becomes a reminder of fairness and honesty. To act on the square is to act uprightly, to keep one's conduct aligned even when no one is watching. It is a quiet standard, not enforced by punishment, but by personal conscience. The compass, equally simple, carries a different lesson. It draws circles, limits space, defines boundaries. In building, it keeps proportions harmonious. In symbolism, it suggests restraint. The idea that freedom does not mean limitlessness, but balance. That to live well is to know where to stop, where to draw the line between desire and discipline. Together, the square and compass speak to a harmony between action and intention, between what is done and why it is done. These tools were familiar to Masons long before they carried symbolic weight. They were part of daily labor. Their transformation into symbols was not an invention, but an extension, a recognition that the lessons learned through repeated physical use could apply just as easily to the shaping of character. Over time, these tools became visual shorthand for ideas that were difficult to explain directly. Then there is the level. On a building site, it ensures that surfaces are even, that weight is distributed fairly. In the symbolic sense, it reminds members that all stand equal in the lodge. Outside, the world may divide people by wealth, status, or power. Inside, these distinctions are set aside. The level does not erase difference, but it places everyone on the same foundation. This was a radical idea in societies deeply structured by hierarchy. The plumb line, hanging straight and true, teaches another lesson. It reveals whether a structure rises properly or drifts subtly off course. Symbolically, it becomes a measure of integrity, a reminder to remain upright in conduct, to align inner values with outward behavior. Like many symbols, its power lies in its simplicity. There is no need for explanation when the image itself communicates the idea. Symbols also served a practical purpose in a largely illiterate world. Not everyone could read or write, but everyone could recognize a shape. A symbol could convey complex instruction or identity without a single word spoken. This practicality blended seamlessly with deeper meaning, allowing symbols to function on multiple levels at once. As Freemasonry became more reflective and less tied to physical labor, symbols took on greater prominence. They became anchors for meditation and discussion. Rather than delivering lectures, members could contemplate a symbol and arrive at personal insights. This method respected individual interpretation while maintaining a shared language. Perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of these symbols is the assumption that they conceal hidden messages. In truth, most of them are openly displayed. They appear on buildings, artwork, books, and monuments. Their meanings are not secret so much as subtle. They reveal themselves only when someone pauses long enough to reflect. Consider the all-seeing eye, often surrounded by confusion and suspicion. Long before it was associated with Freemasonry, it appeared in ancient cultures as a symbol of awareness and watchfulness. It represented the idea that actions matter, that there's always something greater than the individual perspective. In a moral sense, it serves as a reminder that one is accountable not only to others, but to oneself. This sense of inward accountability runs through much of Masonic symbolism. The emphasis is not on external authority, but on self-examination. Symbols act as mirrors, reflecting questions rather than providing answers. They ask the viewer to consider whether their actions align with their values, whether their life is balanced, whether they are building something lasting. The use of light and darkness further reinforces this reflective approach. Darkness is not portrayed as evil, but as ignorance or unawareness. Light represents understanding, insight, and clarity. The journey from darkness to light is not a dramatic revelation, but a gradual process of learning. This metaphor resonates deeply because it mirrors human experience. Knowledge is rarely sudden. It unfolds over time. Symbols also create continuity. A Mason centuries ago would recognize the same tools depicted today. This unbroken visual language connects generations who never met, allowing ideas to travel through time without distortion. In a world where words change meaning and customs fade, symbols remain remarkably stable. There is also comfort in this stability. To contemplate a symbol used by countless others before you is to feel part of something larger, something enduring. It reminds the mind that individual lives are brief, but ideas can persist when cared for thoughtfully. This care is reflected in the way symbols are presented. They are not shouted. They are placed quietly, often in plain sight, inviting discovery rather than demanding attention. Their power lies in suggestion, not assertion. They do not insist on belief. They invite reflection. For those unfamiliar with this language, symbols can seem empty or overly mysterious. There is a moment in every meaningful journey when familiarity falls away. A moment when the noise of the outside world softens and attention turns inward. For those entering the lodge, this moment was never meant to shock or overwhelm. It was meant to slow the mind, to create a pause between what was known and what might be learned. Becoming was not an event. It was a process, carefully shaped to be felt rather than explained. Initiation, as it developed within Freemasonry, drew from older human instincts. Across cultures and centuries, rites of passage have marked transitions from one state of being to another, childhood to adulthood, ignorance to understanding, outsider to participant. These moments were often quiet, symbolic, and deliberately structured, not to impress, but to imprint. The Masonic initiation followed the same ancient rhythm. The candidate did not enter the lodge as one might enter any other room. The act was intentional. Movement was slow. Silence was meaningful. The familiar world was temporarily set aside so that attention could be focused. This separation was not meant to induce fear, but awareness. When distractions fade, even simple gestures gain weight. Inside the lodge, nothing happened by accident. The placement of objects, the pacing of speech, the measured pauses between actions all served a purpose. They guided the mind away from habit and toward presence. In a world where days blurred together, this deliberate structure created contrast. It told the participant, without words, that this moment mattered. The initiation did not reveal secret knowledge in the dramatic sense often imagined. There were no shocking truths unveiled, no hidden powers bestowed. Instead, the experience introduced a way of thinking. Lessons were presented symbolically, allowing them to settle gently rather than forcing immediate understanding. Meaning was not delivered fully formed. It was left partially open, inviting reflection over time. This approach respected the individuality of each participant. Two people could experience the same ritual and come away with different insights, shaped by their own lives and values. The lodge did not dictate interpretation. It provided a framework within which interpretation could grow. The journey of becoming emphasized humility. The candidate was reminded, subtly and repeatedly, that learning begins with acknowledging what one does not yet know. This was not meant to diminish, but to prepare. Just as an apprentice builder first learned to observe before shaping stone, the initiate learned to listen before drawing conclusions. Symbols played a central role here. Rather than explaining moral principles outright, the ritual allowed symbols to speak. A tool, a gesture, a moment of stillness could convey more than a lecture ever could. These symbols were not puzzles to be solved, but companions to be lived with. Their meaning unfolded slowly, sometimes resurfacing years later in moments of unexpected clarity. The atmosphere of the initiation was intentionally calm. Voices were measured, movements deliberate. This calmness was not merely aesthetic. It served a psychological purpose. When the body relaxes, the mind becomes receptive. Lessons absorbed in such a state tend to linger, settling beneath the surface rather than passing quickly through conscious thought. There was also an element of trust being built. Trust in the process. Trust in those guiding it. Trust in oneself. By stepping into an unfamiliar environment and engaging sincerely, the initiate practiced a form of openness that extended beyond the lodge. This trust was reciprocal. The lodge, in turn, entrusted the initiate with participation in its shared tradition. Importantly, the initiation did not mark an end point. It marked a beginning. To be initiated was not to be enlightened, but to be invited. The journey ahead was expected to be gradual, shaped by personal effort rather than bestowed authority. Advancement came not through ambition, but through patience. This emphasis on gradual progress reflected the realities of the craft from which Freemasonry emerged. A wall built too quickly cracks. A foundation laid without care shifts. The same principles applied inwardly. Character, like stonework, required time. Mistakes were part of learning, not reasons for exclusion. The ritual of becoming also served to equalize. Regardless of status outside the lodge, all candidates experienced the same process. Titles, wealth, and influence were temporarily set aside. What remained was the individual, encountering symbols and ideas on equal footing with all who come before. This shared experience fostered a quiet sense of connection. For some, the initiation was memorable in its details. For others, it was memorable in its feeling. Both responses were valid. The lodge understood that meaning does not always announce itself immediately. Sometimes it rests quietly, waiting for the right moment to emerge. This patience distinguished the Masonic approach from many other forms of instruction. There was no pressure to demonstrate understanding quickly, no test of memorization. Growth was assumed to be internal and ongoing. The true measure of learning was behavior over time, not performance in the moment. The concept of becoming extended beyond the initial ritual. Each degree, each stage of progression, reinforced the idea that development is layered. One does not discard earlier lessons when moving forward. They are integrated, refined, and deepened. The initiate remained, in a sense, always becoming. This philosophy resonated deeply with those who experienced it. In a world increasingly focused on speed and results, the lodge offered something different. It valued consistency over urgency, depth over display, reflection over reaction. Critics often misunderstood this slowness as secrecy. But what was being protected was not information. It was process. The lodge guarded the conditions under which meaningful learning could occur. Silence, structure, and symbolism were tools to create those conditions. As the initiate left the lodge after that first experience, nothing outwardly had changed. The world looked the same. The streets were familiar. And yet, something subtle had shifted. A new lens had been offered, not imposed. A way of seeing that emphasized balance, intention, and awareness. The ritual of becoming did not claim to transform a person overnight. It planted a seed. Whether that seed grew depended entirely on the individual. The lodge could provide guidance, but the work was personal. In this way, initiation was less about joining an organization and more about entering a conversation, one that had been unfolding quietly for centuries. A conversation carried not through proclamations, but through shared experience and reflective silence. And perhaps this is why the ritual endured, not because it was dramatic, but because it was human. It acknowledged uncertainty. It respected time. It trusted that meaning, when approached gently, has a way of revealing itself when the mind is finally ready to listen. Progress is often imagined as a straight line, a steady climb towards some final destination. But within the Masonic tradition, progress was understood differently. It was seen as a series of steps, each one meant to be fully experienced before the next could be understood. Not a race upward, but a journey inward. The idea of degrees was never intended to create hierarchy for its own sake, but to provide structure to personal growth. The earliest degrees emerged naturally from the stages of learning familiar to working masons. An apprentice did not become skilled overnight. He observed, assisted, practiced, and only gradually took on greater responsibility. This practical model translated seamlessly into the symbolic world of Freemasonry. Each degree represented a different phase of understanding, a distinct lens through which to view oneself and the world. The first degree introduced the individual to the foundational ideas of the craft. It emphasized beginnings, awareness, the recognition that there is always more to learn. This stage was less about instruction and more about orientation. It asked the individual to become attentive, to notice patterns, symbols, and behaviors that might otherwise go unquestioned. It was an invitation to step onto the path, not a declaration of arrival. The second degree built upon this foundation by encouraging deeper engagement. Here, the focus shifted toward understanding relationships between thought and action, intention and outcome. The individual was encouraged to refine perception, to see how small adjustments in conduct could produce meaningful change. Just as a builder learns to appreciate the balance of forces within a structure, the Mason learned to appreciate balance within life. The third degree, often regarded as the most profound, addressed themes of transformation and continuity. It confronted the individual with impermanence and the idea that growth often requires letting go of old assumptions. This stage was not meant to be dramatic or unsettling, but reflective. It acknowledged that maturity brings with it an awareness of limits, and that wisdom often arises from accepting them. What is important to understand is that these degrees were not checkpoints to be rushed through. Advancement was not automatic. It depended on time, participation, and personal reflection. The lodge did not measure progress by enthusiasm or ambition, but by consistency. It valued those who returned regularly, who listened carefully, who applied lessons quietly in their lives. This approach contrasted sharply with the outside world, where advancement often depended on visibility or competition. Within the lodge, progress was inward and often invisible. A person could hold no rank and yet be deeply respected for their steadiness and integrity. The degrees provided structure, but they did not define worth. The latter imagery, sometimes associated with degrees, can be misleading. It suggests height and separation. In reality, the degrees function more like layers. Each new understanding did not replace the previous one. It rested upon it. The lessons of the first degree remained relevant even after reaching the third. In this way, progress was cumulative rather than linear. The use of ritual within each degree reinforced this layered learning. Repetition played a crucial role. Experiencing similar symbols and movements across different contexts allowed deeper meanings to emerge over time. What once seemed simple could later feel profound, not because it changed, but because the individual had changed. The lodge also recognized that not everyone moved at the same pace. Life circumstances, temperament, and personal inclination all influenced the journey. This variability was not seen as a flaw, but as a reality of human experience. The degrees provided guidance, not pressure. Beyond the primary degrees, additional systems developed over time, offering further exploration for those who wished it. These systems did not supersede the foundational degrees. They expanded upon them, offering different perspectives and symbolic frameworks. Participation was optional, reinforcing the idea that there was no single correct path. This openness allowed Freemasonry to adapt across cultures and eras. Different regions emphasized different aspects of tradition, reflecting local values and concerns. Yet the core structure remained recognizable, anchored by the familiar rhythm progression. At its heart, the degree system taught patience. It reminded members that meaningful change cannot be rushed, that understanding unfolds in stages, that wisdom often appears gradually, shaped by experience rather than instruction. This patience extended beyond the lodge. Members were encouraged to carry this mindset into their daily lives, to approach challenges thoughtfully, to resist the urge for immediate resolution, to value steady effort over dramatic action. The latter, then, was not a tool for comparison, but a metaphor for self-awareness. Each step invited reflection on where one stood and where one wished to go. The climb was personal. No two journeys looked the same. Critics often misunderstood the structure, interpreting degrees as evidence of secrecy or elitism. But from within, the experience felt far more modest. The degrees did not grant authority over others. They offer responsibility to oneself. The true measure of advancement was not what one knew, but how one behaved, how one treated others, how one responded to uncertainty. These qualities could not be tested in ritual alone. They revealed themselves over time, in ordinary moments. As members progressed, they often found that the most valuable lessons were not the most complex. Simplicity carried depth. A single symbol, revisited after years of experience, could offer new insight. The degrees taught that understanding is not exhausted by explanation. This perspective encouraged humility. No matter how far one progressed, there was always more to consider. The journey did not end with mastery, but with acceptance of ongoing growth. In this way, the ladder never truly reached the top. It extended as far as the individual was willing to climb, not in search of status, but in pursuit of clarity. Each step was an opportunity to pause, to look inward, and to continue shaping the inner structure with the same care once applied to stone. And perhaps this is the quiet genius of the degree system. It offers direction without destination, progress without finality, a journey defined not by where it ends, but by how thoughtfully each step is taken along the way. Tension often arises not from what is said, but from what is left unsaid. When two systems of meaning exist side by side, each offering its own language, symbols, and authority, misunderstanding becomes almost inevitable. This was the quiet space in which Freemasonry and the Church found themselves over centuries, close enough to observe one another, distant enough to grow wary. In medieval Europe, the Church stood at the center of daily life. It shaped education, morality, and the rhythm of time itself. Bells marked the hours. Feast days and fasts structured the year. Meaning flowed from doctrine, and authority flowed downward through a clearly defined hierarchy. For generations, this system provided stability in a world that was often harsh and uncertain. The early operative Masons existed comfortably within this religious landscape. They built cathedrals, monasteries, and churches. Their labor was considered sacred, their skill a form of devotion. There was no inherent conflict. The lodge served the church's physical needs, and the church provided spiritual context for the Masons' work. The tension did not begin with stone, but with ideas. As Freemasonry slowly shifted from a purely operative craft to a more speculative tradition, its focus broadened. The lodge became a place not just for planning buildings, but for discussing moral philosophy, personal conduct, and the nature of knowledge itself. These discussions did not reject religion, but they were not confined by it either. Meaning was explored through symbolism rather than scripture, through reflection rather than doctrine. This subtle independence was enough to raise concern. The Church had long guarded the boundaries of acceptable thought, not out of malice, but out of a belief that unity of belief protected society from chaos. Private gatherings where men discussed morality without clerical oversight felt unsettling. Questions began to form, not always clearly articulated, but deeply felt. What were these men discussing behind closed doors? Who defined their moral compass? To whom were they ultimately accountable? From the perspective of the lodge, the answer seemed simple. Members were accountable to their conscience, to shared ethical principles, and to the quiet discipline of self-examination. Faith was respected, but not prescribed. Men of different beliefs could sit together without debate or conversion. The lodge did not replace religion. It asked only that belief remain a personal matter. This distinction, however, was difficult to accept within an institution built upon shared doctrine. The Church understood belief as something communal and declared. Freemasonry treated belief as something inward and symbolic. These approaches were not easily reconciled. Over time, suspicion hardened into opposition. Papal edicts condemned Freemasonry, accusing it of secrecy, relativism, and moral ambiguity. The language was often vague, reflecting uncertainty more than evidence. What troubled church authorities most was not a specific action, but the existence of a parallel moral space, one that operated without ecclesiastical approval. It is important to note that Freemasonry did not respond with open rebellion. There were no counter-declarations, no organized resistance. Lodges continued quietly where they could, adapted where necessary, and dissolved where pressure became overwhelming. This restraint reinforced the impression of secrecy, even as it stemmed from a desire to avoid conflict. For many individual members, the tension was deeply personal. A man could be a devout Christian and a committed Mason without seeing contradiction. He attended church, observed religious rituals, and participated in lodge meetings that focused on ethical self-improvement. To him, these spheres addressed different aspects of life. One spoke of faith and salvation. The other spoke of conduct and character. Yet institutions rarely view such compartmentalization kindly. Systems of authority tend to resist overlap, especially when they cannot control it. The Church feared that Freemasonry symbolic language might dilute doctrinal clarity, that its emphasis on reason and reflection could encourage doubt where certainty was prized. The Enlightenment intensified this unease. As scientific inquiry expanded and traditional explanations were questioned, Freemasonry became associated, sometimes unfairly, with rationalism and secularism. Lodges were seen as places where new ideas circulated freely, unbound by tradition. Whether or not this perception matched reality mattered less than the anxiety it produced. In some regions, this anxiety translated into legal and social consequences. Freemasons faced exclusion, surveillance, and at times persecution. Lodges were forced underground or disbanded altogether. Yet even under pressure, the core principles remained unchanged. The tradition did not seek martyrdom. It valued continuity over confrontation. What is often overlooked is how deeply this tension reflected broader cultural shifts. Europe was moving from a world defined by unquestioned authority toward one shaped by individual conscience and inquiry. The conflict between Freemasonry and the Church mirrored this transition. It was less a battle between organizations and more a symptom of changing ways of understanding truth. The Church spoke in absolutes. Freemasonry spoke in symbols. One offered answers. The other offered questions. Neither approach was inherently hostile, but they operated on different frequencies. Where doctrine demanded clarity, symbolism invited ambiguity. Where authority asserted, reflection hesitated. This difference in tone created space for fear. Symbols, by their nature, resist singular interpretation. To those accustomed to clear declarations, this openness could feel dangerous. What could be interpreted one way today might be understood differently tomorrow. Stability seemed at risk. Yet from within the lodge, symbolism provided resilience. It allowed ideas to adapt without breaking. Members could engage deeply without being forced into agreement. This flexibility helped Freemasonry survive across cultures and centuries, even as external pressures mounted. As the world edged slowly out of the medieval mindset, a new way of thinking began to glow softly across Europe. like candlelight spreading from room to room. It was not a sudden awakening, but a gradual shift, a quiet questioning of inherited truths, and an increasing confidence in human reason. This period would later be called the Enlightenment, though for those living through it, it simply felt like a widening of the mind. And within this widening space, Freemasonry found itself uniquely positioned. Coffee houses replaced cloisters as centers of discussion. Printing presses multiplied ideas at a pace never before imagined. People began to ask not only what they believed, but why they believed it. Authority was no longer accepted automatically. It was examined, debated, weighed. This did not mean faith disappeared, but it shared space with curiosity. The world felt suddenly open to interpretation. Freemasonry did not create this atmosphere, but it absorbed it naturally. Lodges had already developed habits of discussion, reflection, and symbolic thinking. They were accustomed to exploring ideas indirectly, through metaphor rather than proclamation. As Enlightenment ideals spread, the lodge became a place where these ideas could be considered calmly, without the urgency or danger often found in public debate. Within the lodge, men from different backgrounds could sit together as equals. A noble, a merchant, a scholar, and a craftsman could engage in conversation without the weight of rank. This was not revolutionary in a dramatic sense, but it was quietly transformative. The mere act of listening across social boundaries reshaped how individuals understood authority and value. Reason, in the Masonic sense, was never meant to replace tradition. It was meant to refine it. Enlightenment thinkers often sought to strip away superstition, but Freemasonry approached this cautiously. Symbols were not discarded. They were reinterpreted. Rituals were not abandoned. They were understood as teaching tools rather than mystical acts. The lodge became a bridge between old forms and new ideas. Discussions within lodges often turned toward ethics rather than theology. What does it mean to live well? How should power be exercised? What responsibilities accompany knowledge? These questions did not demand uniform answers. They encouraged thoughtful disagreement, a skill increasingly valued in an age of expanding discourse. This atmosphere of measured inquiry made Freemasonry attractive to those navigating the uncertainties of a changing world. Scientists, philosophers, and reformers found the lodge a space where ideas could be tested gently, without immediate consequence. Conversations could unfold slowly, shaped by respect rather than rhetoric. Importantly, Freemasonry did not align itself formally with any political movement. Its influence during this period came not from directives, but from relationships. Ideas traveled along personal networks, carried from lodge to lodge, city to city, country to country. This diffusion was subtle, often invisible, but powerful in its cumulative effect. The Enlightenment emphasized education as a means of progress. Freemasonry echoed this emphasis, but framed it as self-education. Members were encouraged to study, reflect, and improve not because society demanded it, but because personal growth was seen as a moral responsibility. This inward focus distinguished the lodge from more overtly activist groups. As monarchies and institutions felt the pressure of new ideas, suspicion sometimes fell upon any space where independent thought flourished. Lodges, with their private meetings and symbolic language, attracted attention. Yet again, perception often exceeded reality. Freemasonry was less a driver of revolution than a mirror of intellectual change already underway. That said, it would be inaccurate to suggest that Freemasonry was untouched by political currents. Many members participated actively in public life. They carried with them habits of dialogue, compromise, and ethical reflection shaped by lodge experience. These habits influenced how they approached governance, reform, and conflict. The American and French revolutions are often cited in connection with Freemasonry, sometimes with exaggerated claims of orchestration. In truth, the relationship was far more nuanced. Freemasonry did not plan these upheavals, but it existed within the same intellectual climate that made them possible. Shared values such as liberty, equality, and fraternity were not secret doctrines. They were widely circulating ideals of the time. Within lodges, these ideals were explored philosophically rather than implemented politically. The focus remained on personal conduct and mutual respect. Yet when members stepped back into the world, these reflections inevitably shaped their actions. Change occurred not through conspiracy, but through countless individual choices informed by a common ethical language. The Enlightenment also brought an increased interest in universal principles. Thinkers searched for ideas that transcended culture, religion, and nationality. Freemasonry resonated with this search. Its symbolism was intentionally broad, allowing people of different backgrounds to find meaning without conflict. The concept of a shared moral foundation appealed to those weary of sectarian division. This universality, however, came at a cost. Critics accused Freemasonry of relativism, of weakening traditional bonds. The lodge's refusal to endorse specific doctrines was interpreted as indifference or deception. Once again, ambiguity bred suspicion. Yet ambiguity was precisely what allowed Freemasonry to endure. By resisting rigid definitions, it avoided being trapped by any single moment in history. As Enlightenment ideals evolved into modern values, the lodge adapted without abandoning its core. The quiet nature of this adaptation is often overlooked. History tends to focus on dramatic declarations and visible movements. Freemasonry operated differently. Its influence was diffuse, embedded in personal relationships and daily behavior. It shaped how people listened, reasoned, and cooperated, rather than what slogans they proclaimed. When the story of Freemasonry reaches the shores of early America, it often becomes louder than it needs to be. Names grow larger. Symbols feel heavier. Whispers turn into claims of hidden design. Yet the reality, when approached slowly and without urgency, feels far more human and far less orchestrated. It is a story not of secret control, but of ordinary people navigating extraordinary change with the tools they already had. The American colonies were places of tension long before revolution. They were caught between loyalty and frustration, tradition and possibility. Life was shaped by distance from monarchs, from institutions, from the familiar structures of Europe. In this space, ideas traveled differently. Conversations mattered. Relationships mattered. Gatherings, whether in taverns, churches, or private homes, became places where uncertainty could be shared. Freemasonry arrived in this environment quietly. Lodges formed in port cities where ideas flowed in with ships and sailors. Merchants, craftsmen, printers, and professionals found in the lodge something familiar from Europe, yet adaptable to the new world. It offered structure without imposing ideology, fellowship without demanding conformity. Many of the men who would later be remembered as founding fathers were members of lodges, but membership alone did not define their beliefs or actions. It simply placed them in rooms where discussion was thoughtful, where hierarchy softened, and where personal conduct mattered as much as opinion. In a society still defining itself, this mattered. The lodge did not tell its members what political stance to take. It did not plan rebellion or draft declarations. What it did provide was a shared ethical language. Concepts like fairness, restraint, responsibility, and mutual respect were not debated abstractly. They were reinforced through ritual and symbol. These ideas followed members out of the lodge and into their public lives, shaping how they approach leadership and disagreement. This is where myth begins to grow. From a distance, shared membership looks like coordination. Symbols on documents and buildings invite interpretation. Over time, the temptation to connect dots becomes irresistible. It is easier to imagine a hidden hand than to accept that complex change can arise from shared values rather than secret commands. Take George Washington, often placed at the center of Masonic speculation. He was indeed a Freemason, and he valued the fraternity's emphasis on character and discipline. But his letters and actions reveal a man guided more by pragmatism than mysticism. He attended lodge meetings when he could, supported Masonic events, and spoke of the organization in measured terms. There is no evidence that his leadership was directed by lodge doctrine. His decisions were shaped by circumstance, experience, and responsibility rather than ritual. Benjamin Franklin presents a similar case. Curious, inquisitive, and deeply engaged with Enlightenment thought, he found Freemasonry compatible with his worldview. It provided social connection and a framework for ethical reflection. But Franklin's ideas were shaped by a wide range of influences: science, philosophy, diplomacy, not by any single affiliation. The same pattern repeats with other figures. Freemasonry was part of their lives, not the center of them. It offered continuity in a time of upheaval, a place where discussion could remain civil even as opinions diverged sharply. The American Revolution itself was not a unified movement driven by a single ideology. It was a patchwork of motives: economic frustration, political principle, personal grievance, and hope for autonomy. Freemasons existed on both sides of the conflict. Some remained loyal to the crown. Others supported independence. Lodges did not issue political directives. Members acted according to conscience and circumstance. This diversity challenges the idea of Freemasonry as a controlling force. If the organization had sought dominance, consistency would have been essential. Instead, variation prevailed. What united members was not a political goal, but a commitment to ethical conduct and mutual respect. Symbols often cited as evidence of Masonic influence, such as those found on currency or architecture, reflect broader cultural currents rather than secret intent. Enlightenment imagery was widely used and understood. The eye, the pyramid, the emphasis on balance and order, these were part of shared visual language of the time. Their presence does not imply hidden governance, but common inspiration. The founding documents themselves speak openly. They argue their case plainly, appealing to reason, experience, and shared values. There is no coded language, no veiled instruction. The power of these texts lies in their clarity, not their concealment. What Freemasonry contributed to this moment was not a plan, but a practice. The practice of gathering peacefully, of listening across difference, of framing moral questions in ways that encourage reflection rather than dogma. These habits mattered deeply in a society attempting to invent itself. As the new nation took shape, Freemasonry continued to exist as one thread among many. Lodges supported charitable efforts, community building, and social connection. They offered familiarity in a rapidly changing world. But they did not occupy the center of power. They remained on the periphery, shaping individuals rather than institutions. Over time, as America grew and myths accumulated, Freemasonry's presence in its early history became exaggerated. Stories hardened into narratives. Suspicion replaced nuance. The human tendency to seek simple explanations transformed a complex web of influences into a single imagined source. Yet when examined calmly, the picture becomes clearer. Freemasonry did not create American ideals. It echoed them. It did not command leaders. It accompanied them. It did not design the nation. It reflected the values already circulating within it. The danger of myth is not that it distorts facts, but that it overshadows understanding. When we reduce history to hidden plots, we miss the quieter forces that truly shape societies: conversation, reflection, and shared ethical ground. Fear has a way of growing in the spaces where understanding stops. When something is partially seen, partially heard, and never fully explained, the imagination rushes in to complete the picture. This is how shadows become monsters, and how silence becomes suspicion. For Freemasonry, this process unfolded slowly, across centuries, until myth and rumor began to feel more real than history itself. Secrecy, even when practical or symbolic, has always unsettled societies. What cannot be observed cannot be easily trusted. In earlier centuries, when loyalty and belief were tightly controlled, private gatherings were viewed with particular anxiety. A closed door suggested exclusion. A symbol suggested hidden meaning. And once curiosity hardened into fear, explanation rarely softened it. The first conspiracy surrounding Freemasonry did not emerge from evidence, but from uncertainty. Outsiders saw men meeting privately, using unfamiliar language, and refusing to explain their rituals in detail. In a culture accustomed to public declarations of faith and allegiance, this restraint felt dangerous. If something was harmless, why not explain it openly? Why the silence? From within the lodge, the answer felt simple. Silence preserved the integrity of the experience. Symbols work best when encountered personally, not reduced to explanation. But this inward-facing logic did little to calm those already suspicious. The more Freemasonry declined to defend itself loudly, the more others assumed there was something to hide. Political upheaval intensified this dynamic. In times of instability, societies search for causes. They seek figures to blame, forces to name. Freemasonry, with its international presence and private structure, became an easy target. It was familiar enough to feel relevant, yet obscure enough to resist verification. Anti-Masonic movements rose and fell across Europe and America. Pamphlets accused lodges of manipulating governments, corrupting religion, and undermining morality. These accusations rarely agreed with one another. In some narratives, Freemasons were portrayed as atheists, in others as agents of a shadowy faith. The contradictions mattered less than the emotional impact. Fear does not require consistency. What is striking is how little actual Freemasonry appears in these stories. The everyday reality of lodge meetings, routine, ceremonial, often mundane, was replaced by imagined councils of power. The symbolic language meant to encourage reflection was recast as code. Silence became strategy. Ambiguity became proof. One of the most enduring conspiracy patterns is the belief that Freemasonry controls global events. Wars, revolutions, economic shifts, each is attributed to hidden coordination. This narrative offers comfort in a strange way. It suggests that chaos is a cause, that history is not random, but guided by intention. Even if that intention is malevolent, it feels easier to grasp than complexity. Yet, when examined closely, the evidence dissolves. Freemasons have never acted as a unified political body. They have held opposing views, fought on opposing sides, lived under opposing governments. Lodges have been suppressed, infiltrated, and destroyed by the very forces they are accused of controlling. Such contradictions rarely trouble conspiracy thinking, which thrives on selective attention. Symbols play a central role in these narratives. The human mind is drawn to patterns, especially visual ones. When a symbol appears in multiple places, it invites interpretation. The ion currency, the compass in architecture. The repetition feels intentional, purposeful. Yet symbols are shared cultural artifacts. They migrate, adapt, and accumulate meaning over time. The problem arises when symbolism is treated as evidence rather than expression. A symbol is not a command. It does not direct events. It reflects ideas already present in a culture. The Enlightenment visual language that shaped early modern symbolism was not owned by Freemasonry. It was shared widely across art, philosophy, and political thought. Still, the appeal of conspiracy endures. It transforms history into a narrative with villains and hidden heroes. It offers certainty where ambiguity exists. It allows individuals to feel initiated into a deeper truth, even if that truth is imagined. In this sense, conspiracy thinking mirrors some of the psychological needs that Freemasonry itself addresses: the desire for meaning, belonging, and understanding. Ironically, many conspiracy narratives borrow the language of initiation and revelation. They promise hidden knowledge accessible only to those willing to look beyond appearances. They frame skepticism as blindness and belief as awakening. This structure is emotionally compelling, but it replaces reflection with conviction. Freemasonry's actual teachings caution against this mindset. They emphasize humility, patience, and self-examination. They warn against certainty without understanding. Yet these quieter lessons are easily overshadowed by louder stories. In the modern era, the spread of information has not diminished conspiracy thinking. It has accelerated it. Images circulate without context. Claims multiply faster than they can be examined. Algorithms reward emotional engagement over careful analysis. In this environment, Freemasonry remains a convenient symbol, a recognizable name onto which anxieties can be projected. It is tempting to respond to conspiracy with dismissal or ridicule, but this often deepens division. Fear is rarely dissolved by argument alone. It requires understanding the emotional roots beneath the claims. Conspiracy thrives where people feel excluded, powerless, or mistrustful of institutions. It offers a sense of agency, even if that agency is illusory. Freemasonry, by its nature, does not engage in public defense campaigns. It continues quietly, focused inward rather than outward. This restraint is often misinterpreted as confirmation, but it reflects a different priority. The tradition values personal transformation over public perception. It trusts time more than debate. Over centuries, many accusations have faded, replaced by new ones shaped by new fears. There is a particular kind of moment that happens when you notice something you have seen many times before, but never truly looked at. A symbol on a building facade, a design on a coin, a carving above a doorway you have walked under without a second thought. Once noticed, it cannot be unseen. And suddenly, the world feels subtly different, as though it has been quietly speaking a language you never knew how to hear. Freemasonry is often said to hide its symbols, yet most of them are not hidden at all. They exist in plain sight, woven into architecture, public spaces, art, and everyday objects. What makes them seem secret is not their invisibility, but our unfamiliarity with their language. When meaning is not immediately explained, the mind fills the gap with curiosity. Cities are full of these quiet markers. Old civic buildings display balanced proportions and geometric harmony that echo the principles of classical design. Courthouses, libraries, and halls of learning often reflect ideals of order, fairness, and stability through their structure alone. These choices were not always explicitly Masonic, but they emerged from the same intellectual environment that valued symmetry, reason, and moral clarity. Architecture, especially, speaks slowly. It does not shout. It invites the eye to rest, to wander, to feel proportion rather than analyze it. When Freemasons contributed to public buildings, they did not embed secret instructions into stone. They brought with them a preference for balance and symbolism that was already widely respected. Columns, arches, and carefully aligned entrances communicated dignity and purpose to anyone who entered, regardless of whether they recognized the deeper associations. Currency is another space where symbols quietly circulate. Coins and paper money pass through countless hands, carrying imagery chosen to reflect national identity and values. The presence of eyes, pyramids, or classical motifs often spark speculation. Yet these images were drawn from a shared symbolic vocabulary rooted in Enlightenment thought. They represented vigilance, strength, continuity, and aspiration, concepts meant to reassure rather than conceal. The all-seeing eye, perhaps the most discussed of these symbols, is a perfect example of misunderstanding through familiarity. Long before it appeared on modern currency, it symbolized awareness and moral accountability in religious and philosophical traditions. Its placement was meant to suggest watchfulness, not surveillance, a reminder that actions matter, even when unobserved. Over time, this gentle message became overshadowed by darker interpretations, shaped by cultural anxiety rather than historical context. Walking through older neighborhoods, one might notice square and compass imagery etched subtly into cornerstones or plaques. These marks often commemorate the individuals or lodges involved in construction. They are signatures rather than signals, public acknowledgments of participation, not coded messages to the initiated. To the builder, such a mark was a point of pride, a quiet statement of workmanship and values. Yet when viewed through a modern lens accustomed to secrecy and spectacle, these symbols feel charged. The mind searches for hidden layers, assuming intention beyond aesthetics. This impulse is deeply human. We are pattern-seeking by nature, especially when faced with ambiguity. Symbols thrive on ambiguity. They invite interpretation rather than enforce meaning. This is why they endure across time and culture. A symbol can carry one meaning for a builder, another for a philosopher, and still another for a passerby centuries later. None of these interpretations are necessarily wrong. They coexist, layered upon one another like sediment. Freemasonry embraced this quality deliberately. Symbols were chosen not to restrict understanding, but to allow it to grow. A symbol encountered at one stage of life might seem simple. Encountered again years later, it might feel unexpectedly profound. This flexibility is often mistaken for deception, when in reality it reflects respect for individual experience. Public monuments also bear traces of this symbolic tradition. Obelisks, columns, and carefully aligned memorials reflect ancient forms associated with memory, endurance, and aspiration. These shapes were not owned by Freemasonry. They predated by millennia. Freemasons, like many others, adopted them because they resonated with universal human themes. When people claim that symbols scattered across cities prove hidden control, they often overlook how cultural influence works. Ideas do not need secret coordination to spread. They move through education, taste, admiration, and imitation. Architects trained in classical principles naturally reproduce them. Patrons who value order commission designs that reflect it. Over time, a visual language emerges organically. What makes Freemasonry distinct is not that its symbols appear in public, but that it encourages people to notice them thoughtfully, not to decode them anxiously, but to reflect on why such symbols continue to resonate, why balance feels reassuring, why symmetry feels just, why light emerging from darkness feels hopeful. Even everyday objects carry echoes of symbolic thinking. Tools themselves, hammers, levels, compasses, are symbols long before they are metaphors. They shape the physical world and, in doing so, teach lessons about patience, accuracy, and cooperation. When Freemasonry adopted these tools symbolically, it did not change their meaning. It extended it. The presence of these symbols in plain sight creates a gentle tension. Once noticed, they can feel everywhere. This can be unsettling at first, as though one has stumbled into a hidden layer of reality. But with time, the feeling softens. The symbols lose their sharpness and become familiar, even comforting. They stop feeling like messages and start feeling like reminders. This shift is important. When symbols are approached with suspicion, they generate fear. When approached with curiosity, they invite understanding. Freemasonry never intended its symbols to be puzzles that unlock power. They were meant to be anchors, visual prompts that draw attention back to certain values amid the noise of life. Modern culture often expects explanations to be immediate and explicit. Symbols resist this demand. They ask for patience. They ask for presence. They do not reveal everything at once, and they do not apologize for it. This resistance is part of their strength. In a fast-moving world, symbols slow us down. They encourage us to look twice, to consider meaning beyond surface function. This slowing can feel uncomfortable, especially when we aren't used to it. But it is also deeply restorative. Freemasonry symbols, scattered openly across the world, serve this quiet purpose. They do not announce membership or allegiance. They do not demand attention. They simply exist, waiting to be noticed by those inclined to notice. For most people, these symbols remain background details, easily ignored. And that is as it should be. Their power lies not in ubiquity, but in readiness. They speak when the observer is prepared to listen. For much of its history, Freemasonry reflected the societies in which it existed, and those societies were shaped by boundaries, some visible, some quietly enforced. Among the most enduring of these boundaries was the exclusion of women. This absence has often been misunderstood as deliberate hostility, but its roots lie deeper, tangled in tradition, labor, and long-standing assumptions about who belonged where in the world. The earliest lodges were born from the world of operative stonemasons, a profession physically demanding and socially restricted. Building sites were harsh places, governed by custom and necessity rather than ideology. Over time, as the craft evolved into a symbolic tradition, many of these inherited assumptions remained unquestioned. The lodge, like most institutions of its era, simply mirrored what was considered normal. This does not mean exclusion went unnoticed or unchallenged. Even in earlier centuries, there were moments when women brushed against the edges of Masonic life. Records speak of rare instances where women were initiated under unusual circumstances, often tied to family legacy or local custom. These stories are few, but they reveal something important, that the boundary was not always absolute, even if it was firmly maintained. As Freemasonry shifted further away from physical labor and toward philosophical reflection, the question of exclusion grew more visible. The lodge increasingly became a space for ideas rather than tools, for conversation rather than construction. And yet, the doors largely remained closed to women, not because of explicit doctrine, but because tradition had hardened into habit. For some, this absence became a source of frustration. Women were active participants in intellectual and social life, particularly as education expanded and public discourse widened. They read the same books, discussed the same ideas, and shared the same moral concerns. To be excluded from a space dedicated to self-improvement and ethical reflection felt increasingly outdated. In response, parallel paths began to form. Women did not wait for permission. They created their own spaces. Co-Masonic and women-only orders emerged, drawing inspiration from Masonic symbolism while adapting it to new contexts. These groups were not rebellions so much as continuations, shaped by the same desire for ritual, reflection, and community. These parallel traditions reveal something essential about Freemasonry's symbolic language. It was never bound to a single gender. The tools, metaphors, and moral lessons resonated just as deeply when interpreted through different experiences. The rough stone, the act of refinement, the pursuit of balance. These ideas were universal, even if their expression had been historically limited. The existence of these alternative orders challenges the notion that Freemasonry's boundaries were fixed by necessity. Instead, they appear increasingly as cultural artifacts, choices shaped by time and place rather than immutable law. In regions where social norms evolved, Masonic traditions adapted. In others, they remained resistant, valuing continuity over change. This uneven evolution has contributed to ongoing debate within the broader Masonic world. Some view the preservation of male-only lodges as an essential link to tradition. Others see it as an unnecessary barrier that obscures the deeper purpose of the craft. Both perspectives are shaped by values, memory, and identity rather than simple logic. What often gets lost in this debate is the human dimension. Exclusion is not an abstract concept. It is felt. For those outside the door, it can feel like silence rather than rejection, an absence of invitation rather than an act of refusal. For those inside, it can feel invisible, unnoticed until questioned. Freemasonry has always placed great emphasis on harmony. Conflict, when it arises, is ideally resolved through patience and dialogue. This approach has shaped how discussions about inclusion unfold. Change, when it comes, is slow, deliberate, and often localized rather than sweeping. In some countries, mixed-gender lodges are accepted and respected. In others, they exist separately, neither condemned nor fully embraced. This diversity reflects Freemasonry's decentralized nature. There is no single authority dictating direction. Each jurisdiction navigates its own relationship with tradition and change. This decentralization allows for coexistence. Parallel paths do not necessarily compete. They reflect different interpretations of the same symbolic language. One emphasizes continuity with the past. Another emphasizes responsiveness to the present. Both claim authenticity, and in their own ways, both are sincere. The question of women in Freemasonry also invites reflection on the nature of tradition itself. Tradition can be a vessel, carrying meaning across generations, but it can also become a boundary, defining who belongs and who does not. The challenge lies in distinguishing which elements are essential and which are inherited habits mistaken for necessity. Freemasonry's own teachings offer tools for this reflection. The idea of refining the rough stone suggests that nothing arrives perfect, not even tradition. Improvement is possible, but it requires effort, humility, and willingness to examine what has been accepted without question. For many women drawn to Masonic symbolism, the appeal is not about joining an exclusive club, but about participating in a shared human process of meaning-making. Ritual offers rhythm. Symbols offer reflection. Community offers support. These needs do not belong to one gender. The parallel orders that emerged over time demonstrate this clearly. They have developed their own histories, rituals, and identities, often deeply rooted in local culture. They stand as evidence that the symbolic framework of Freemasonry is adaptable, capable of holding diverse experiences without losing coherence. At the same time, the persistence of male-only lodges reflects another truth, that tradition carries emotional weight. For many members, the lodge is a link to mentors, ancestors, and shared memory. Change can feel like loss, even when it aims toward inclusion. As Freemasonry spread beyond its early European centers, it did not travel as a rigid system stamped identically onto every place it reached. It moved more like a seed carried by people, shaped by soil, climate, and culture. What grew in each region reflected local traditions, values, and histories, even as it retained a recognizable core. This adaptability is one of the reasons Freemasonry endured across continents rather than fading as a curiosity of a single era. In continental Europe, Freemasonry often intertwined with intellectual life. Lodges became gathering places for thinkers, artists, and reformers who were navigating the tensions between old authority and new ideas. In France, symbolism took on a more philosophical tone, reflecting the country's engagement with Enlightenment thought and political upheaval. Rituals became elaborate, rich in allegory, mirroring a cultural preference for expression and debate. In Britain, where Freemasonry had become more formalized, the emphasis remained on order and continuity. Rituals were carefully preserved, and tradition was treated with particular reverence. This approach reflected a broader cultural tendency to balance innovation with stability. The lodge served as a steady institution in a society that valued gradual change. As Freemasonry moved into Eastern Europe, it encountered different challenges. In regions marked by strong centralized power or religious authority, lodges sometimes operated cautiously, adapting their public presence to avoid conflict. In some places, Freemasonry was embraced as a symbol of modernity and connection to wider European thought. In others, it was viewed with suspicion and periodically suppressed. Outside Europe, the tradition continued to transform. In the Americas, Freemasonry blended with frontier culture and emerging national identities. Lodges became spaces of social cohesion in rapidly changing environments. They offer familiarity in unfamiliar landscapes, helping communities establish shared values amid diversity. In Latin America, Freemasonry often intersected with movements for independence and reform. Lodges provided networks through which ideas of self-determination circulated. Yet, as elsewhere, Freemasonry did not dictate political action. It offered connection rather than command. Members acted according to their circumstances, influenced by a blend of local conditions and shared ideals. In Asia, Freemasonry encountered ancient philosophies and deeply rooted traditions. Rather than displacing them, often coexisted. In parts of India, for example, Masonic lodges included members from diverse religious backgrounds. The symbolic language of Freemasonry, emphasizing moral development and balance, resonated with existing spiritual concepts without attempting to replace them. In Japan, Freemasonry arrived later and remained relatively small, shaped by the country's unique historical trajectory. Where it did exist, it adapted carefully, mindful of cultural norms around secrecy, hierarchy, and social harmony. The tradition's emphasis on discipline and self-improvement found points of connection, even as it remained an imported concept. In Africa, Freemasonry's story is complex and varied. Introduced during periods of colonial influence, it was sometimes associated with foreign power, creating tension. Yet African members also shaped lodges to reflect local values, blending imported ritual with indigenous perspectives on community and responsibility. Over time, Freemasonry became, in some regions, a space for education and leadership development. What unites these diverse expressions is not uniform practice, but shared structure. The use of degrees, symbols, and ritual provided a familiar framework that could be adapted without losing coherence. This balance between consistency and flexibility allowed Freemasonry to feel both local and global at the same time. Critics often mistake this global presence for centralized control. The idea that lodges across continents coordinate secretly to direct events is compelling but unsupported. In reality, Freemasonry lacks a single governing authority. Jurisdictions operate independently, shaped by local law and custom. Decisions made in one region rarely affect another directly. This decentralization produces diversity. Rituals differ. Customs vary. Even interpretations of symbolism are influenced by cultural context. A symbol that evokes one idea in Europe might carry a different emotional weight in Asia or Africa. This multiplicity is not a flaw. It is a feature. Global Freemasonry functions more like a network of shared language than a hierarchy of command. Members traveling between countries often find familiar elements, but also encounter differences that reflect local identity. This experience reinforces the idea that the tradition is a framework rather than a script. The global spread of Freemasonry also highlights its limitations. In some regions, it struggled to take root, either due to cultural resistance or political suppression. In others, it became associated with elite circles, limiting its accessibility. These outcomes reflect local realities rather than universal intent. Despite these challenges, Freemasonry's presence across cultures demonstrates a fundamental human impulse, the desire for shared meaning that transcends immediate circumstance. Ritual, symbolism, and community fulfill this impulse in ways that are remarkably adaptable. As the modern world grows increasingly interconnected, the contrast between Freemasonry's local autonomy and global familiarity becomes more pronounced. It offers a model of cultural exchange that is neither homogenizing nor isolating. Ideas are shared, but interpretation remains personal. This model helps explain why Freemasonry often feels simultaneously familiar and distant. It carries echoes of shared history, yet resists simple definition. It is shaped by where it exists, even as it preserves elements of where it began. For members, this global diversity can be enriching. It provides perspective, reminding them that no single expression holds all truth. For observers, it can be confusing, reinforcing myths of secrecy and control. The reality lies somewhere quieter. Freemasonry's global journey is not a story of conquest or conversion. It is a story of adaptation, of ideas moving gently across boundaries, reshaped by each new context they encounter. It survives not by enforcing sameness, but by allowing difference. In this sense, Freemasonry mirrors the broader human story. Cultures borrow, adapt, and reinterpret. Traditions evolve, sometimes unevenly. Meaning is negotiated rather than dictated. As night settles and the mind drifts across continents and centuries, this quiet adaptability becomes clear. Freemasonry is not one thing everywhere. It is many things, connected by shared symbols and values, yet grounded in local experience. And perhaps this is its most enduring quality. Not the illusion of a hidden global hand, but the reality of countless human hands shaping the same ideas differently, building meaning in ways that reflect both their shared heritage and their unique place in the world. History often feels like a steady march forward when viewed from a distance, but for those living inside it, the movement is uneven. Progress is followed by retreat, openness by fear. Periods of tolerance are interrupted by moments when suspicion hardens into hostility. Freemasonry, quiet by nature and slow to change, has moved through all of these cycles, and during the darkest ones, it learned what it meant to survive. When societies feel threatened, they look for symbols of difference. Anything that does not fit neatly into the prevailing order becomes suspect. Private gatherings, unfamiliar rituals, international connections, these traits, once harmless or even admired, suddenly appear dangerous. Freemasonry, with its closed meetings and symbolic language, became an easy target in times of authoritarian control. Persecution did not arrive all at once. It began with whispers, then warnings, then laws. In various eras and regions, Freemasons were accused of disloyalty, subversion, or moral corruption. The accusations shifted with circumstance, but the pattern remained the same. A group that valued independent thought and private reflection was incompatible with regimes that demanded visible conformity. In some countries, lodges were ordered to close. Records were seized. Symbols were banned. Members were forced to choose between public allegiance and private conviction. For many, this choice was painful. The lodge was not merely an organization. It was a space of trust, friendship, and personal meaning. To abandon it felt like losing a part of oneself. Under totalitarian regimes, the danger intensified. Freemasonry was outlawed alongside other groups considered threatening to centralized authority. In Nazi Germany, Freemasons were persecuted as enemies of the state, their lodges dissolved, their archives confiscated. Members were arrested, imprisoned, and in some cases, killed. Symbols once carved proudly into stone were erased or defaced. What made Freemasonry particularly vulnerable was its refusal to become political in a visible way. It did not organize mass resistance or issue proclamations. This restraint, born of tradition, offered little protection against regimes that interpreted silence as guilt. To the authoritarian mind, ambiguity itself is intolerable. And yet, within this repression, something quietly endured. Freemasonry had never depended on buildings alone. Its essence lived in habits of thought, in shared values carried by individuals. When lodges were forced to close, members did not suddenly forget what they had learned. The language of symbolism, the emphasis on integrity and patience, continued to shape their conduct even in isolation. In occupied countries during wartime, Freemasonry survived in fragments. A conversation held carefully, a gesture of recognition exchanged discreetly. The tradition adapted not through defiance, but through discretion. Survival became an act of quiet endurance rather than open resistance. Not all persecution was as extreme, but even milder suppression left scars. In some places, Freemasonry was portrayed as elitist or foreign, its symbols twisted into evidence of betrayal. Public opinion turned hostile. Membership declined. Fear replaced curiosity. What is striking is how rarely Freemasonry responded with aggression. There were no campaigns to reclaim influence, no efforts to expose oppressors. The tradition retreated inward, preserving itself by focusing on what it could control: personal conduct, ethical reflection, and mutual support among members. This inward focus proved resilient. When regimes fell and restrictions lifted, Freemasonry often reemerged slowly, cautiously. Lodges reopened. Rituals resumed. But the experience of persecution lingered, shaping how the tradition approached visibility and engagement with the wider world. In countries that experienced repeated suppression, Freemasonry learned to value continuity over expansion. Growth was secondary to preservation. The lesson was clear. Survival depended not on numbers or power, but on depth of commitment. Persecution also forced reflection. Why had Freemasonry survived when other organizations vanished? Part of the answer lies in its lack of central authority. Without a single leadership to dismantle, it could not be entirely destroyed. Each lodge, each member, carried a piece of the whole. Another part lies in its modest ambitions. Freemasonry did not seek to govern or dominate. It sought to improve individuals. This inward orientation made it less threatening than movements driven by ideology or ambition, even if it was not always perceived that way. The experience of persecution reshaped Freemasonry's relationship with secrecy. What had once been symbolic privacy became, in some contexts, necessary concealment. Silence shifted from teaching tool to survival strategy. This shift further complicated public perception, reinforcing the association between Freemasonry and hidden activity. Yet even in silence, the tradition did not harden. It did not become rigid or defensive. It remained reflective, adaptable. Members carried forward the understanding that visibility was less important than continuity. After periods of repression, when Freemasonry returned to public life, it often did so humbly. There were no claims of vindication, no demands for recognition. The focus remained on rebuilding trust and reconnecting communities. This humility is rarely acknowledged in popular narratives, which refer drama to endurance, but it is central to understanding how Freemasonry survived repeated attempts to erase it. The story of persecution also reveals a deeper truth about human systems. Institutions that depend on authority crumble when authority turns against them. Traditions that depend on personal conviction endure quietly, carried by individuals who choose to preserve them even when it costs something. Freemasonry survival was not heroic in conventional sense. There were no grand last stands. There was instead a steady refusal to abandon certain values, even when practicing them became difficult or dangerous. As the modern world looks back on these darker chapters, it becomes easier to see how fear shapes history. If you were to step into a Masonic lodge today, the experience might surprise you, not because it feels mysterious or dramatic, but because it feels ordinary, calm, measured. The room is quiet, often modestly furnished, with chairs arranged carefully and symbols placed with intention rather than extravagance. There is no sense of urgency, no spectacle designed to impress. Modern Freemasonry moves at a gentle pace, shaped as much by habit as by heritage. Many lodges meet only once or twice a month. Members arrive after work, greet one another, and settle into familiar roles. There is paperwork to handle, minutes to approve, charitable plans to discuss. Much of the time is spent on routine matters that would feel recognizable in almost any volunteer organization. This ordinariness often confounds expectations shaped by centuries of myth. Ritual still plays a role, but it is not constant. When it appears, it is careful and deliberate, performed from memory, valued for its continuity rather than its novelty. For long-time members, the ritual feels like a well-worn path, familiar, comforting, occasionally surprising in small ways. For newcomers, it can feel formal, even slightly anachronistic, but rarely overwhelming. Modern Freemasonry is, in many ways, quieter than it once was. Membership numbers in many countries have declined, reflecting broader social changes. People have less free time. Community life has shifted online. Ritual and tradition compete with immediacy and convenience. The lodge no longer occupies the central social role it once did. This shift has forced reflection. Some lodges have struggled to adapt, clinging tightly to familiar forms. Others have experimented with outreach, education, and transparency, seeking to remain relevant without abandoning core principles. The balance is delicate. Change too quickly, and the tradition risks losing its identity. Change too slowly, and it risks fading into obscurity. Charity remains one of the most visible aspects of modern Freemasonry. Lodges support local causes, fund scholarships, maintain community spaces, and contribute quietly to relief efforts. These activities rarely attract attention, and that is often intentional. Charity is seen not as publicity, but as responsibility. The members themselves are diverse in background and belief. While the stereotype of the elderly, uniform membership persists, reality is more varied. Younger members do join, though in smaller numbers. They often bring different expectations, valuing openness and dialogue alongside tradition. This generational mix can be challenging, but it also offers renewal. Discussions within modern lodges are often practical rather than philosophical. The deep symbolic exploration of earlier eras competes with the demands of contemporary life. Yet the symbolic framework remains available, waiting to be engaged by those inclined to do so. Freemasonry does not force introspection, it offers it. Technology has subtly reshaped the experience. Communication happens through emails and messaging platforms. Educational materials circulate digitally. Yet rituals remain offline, preserved deliberately from the speed of modern communication. This separation reinforces a lodge as a space apart, a place where time slows slightly. Public perception continues to be shaped by outdated assumptions. For some, Freemasonry feels irrelevant, a relic of another age. For others, it remains suspicious, misunderstood through the lens of conspiracy. Modern lodges navigate this tension carefully, often choosing understatement over explanation. Transparency has increased in some respects. Many lodges maintain websites, publish shareable reports, and open their doors to the public for tours and events. This openness demystifies the tradition without exposing its inner experience. It signals confidence rather than defensiveness. At the same time, certain boundaries remain. Rituals are still private. Symbols are still treated with care. This is not about hiding information, but about preserving atmosphere. Meaning, the tradition holds, is best encountered rather than explained. Modern Freemasonry also grapples with questions of inclusion. Conversations about diversity, relevance, and social responsibility are ongoing. Some lodges adapt quickly. Others move cautiously. The decentralized nature of Freemasonry means there is no single answer, only a range of responses shaped by local context. For many members, the lodge serves as a counterbalance to modern life. It offers structure without pressure, connection without constant engagement. In a world of endless notifications and fragmented attention, the lodge provides a space where focus is restored. This simplicity can feel refreshing. Meetings begin and end on time. Roles are clearly defined. Progress is measured slowly. There is comfort in predictability, especially as other aspects of life grow increasingly fluid. Critics sometimes interpret this slowness as stagnation. From within, it feels more like steadiness. The lodge does not chase trends. It waits to see which ones endure. This patience is both a strength and a vulnerability. Modern Freemasonry does not seek to shape public policy or cultural movements. Its influence, when it exists, is indirect. It shapes how individuals approach responsibility, leadership, and community. These effects are difficult to measure and easy to overlook. What remains consistent is the emphasis on character. Members are encouraged, quietly and persistently, to act with integrity, restraint, and compassion. These values are not unique, but the ritualized context reinforces them in a way that feels grounded rather than abstract. For those who stay, Freemasonry becomes less about mystery and more about companionship. The symbols fade into the background, becoming familiar reference points rather than sources of fascination. What matters most are the relationships formed over time. As years pass, members mark milestones together. They celebrate achievements, mourn losses, and support one another through ordinary struggles. The lodge becomes part of the rhythm of life rather than an escape from it. This ordinariness is perhaps the most revealing aspect of modern Freemasonry. It is not a hidden force shaping the world, nor a relic frozen in time. It is a living tradition, modest in scope, shaped by the people who choose to participate. As night deepens and thoughts slow, this image feels fitting. A quiet room, familiar faces, simple symbols. No grand revelation, no urgent demand. Just a space where time is allowed to move gently, carrying forward an old practice into a new age without insisting that it becomes something it was never meant to be. In this calm continuity, modern Freemasonry finds its place, not as a secret power, but as a steady presence, offering those who enter a chance to pause, reflect, and belong in a world that rarely slows down enough to notice the value of doing so. There is something deeply human about gathering in quiet rooms, closing the door, and sharing meaning through symbols rather than explanations. This impulse appears again and again across history, long before the modern world learned to fear the word secret. To understand Freemasonry fully, it helps to step back from the organization itself and look instead at the broader pattern it belongs to, the pattern of human beings forming societies that feel set apart, not to dominate others, but to explore identity, belonging, and purpose. Humans have always created inner circles. From tribal initiation rites to monastic orders, from guilds to academic fraternities, people have repeatedly drawn lines between those who have shared an experience and those who have not. These lines are rarely about superiority. They are about transition, about marking a moment when someone moves from one state of understanding to another. Psychologically, this serves an important function. When experiences are framed as special, the mind pays closer attention. A lesson delivered casually is easily forgotten. A lesson delivered through ritual, silence, and anticipation embeds itself more deeply. This is why rites of passage exist in nearly every culture. They slow time. They signal importance. They tell the participant, without words, that something meaningful is happening. Freemasonry fits neatly into this pattern. Its use of ritual and degrees does not arise from a desire to exclude, but from a desire to mark progression. The lodge creates a boundary not to keep others out, but to create a focused environment inside, a place where distractions are minimized and reflection is encouraged. Secrecy, in this sense, is often misunderstood. It is less about hiding information and more about protecting experience. There is a difference between knowing about something and living through it. A ritual explained step by step loses its power. The mind anticipates rather than receives. By withholding certain details, Freemasonry preserves the psychological impact of discovery. This approach mirrors how the brain processes meaning. Novelty heightens attention. Uncertainty invites engagement. When everything is explained in advance, the experience becomes flat. Mystery, handled gently, keeps the mind awake without agitating it. This is why symbols are so effective. They do not rush to conclusions. They allow understanding to emerge gradually. Humans are also social creatures who seek belonging. Being part of a group that shares language, symbols, and experiences creates a sense of identity that is both comforting and stabilizing. This identity does not need to be public to be meaningful. In fact, private belonging often feels more authentic because it is not performed for approval. Freemasonry offers this kind of belonging. It does not promise status in the outside world. It offers recognition within a shared framework. This distinction matters. When belonging is internal, it is less fragile. It does not depend on constant validation. Another psychological aspect at play is a desire for order. The world is unpredictable. Life rarely unfolds according to plan. Secret or semi-private societies offer structure in the face of this uncertainty. Meetings follow predictable patterns. Roles are defined. Progress is measured. This regularity provides a sense of control that is not about power over others, but about steadiness within oneself. Freemasonry's emphasis on geometry and balance reflects this need. Straight lines, measured angles, and symmetrical forms reassure the mind. They suggest that chaos can be shaped, that effort leads to improvement. Even when applied symbolically, these ideas resonate deeply. The idea of inner work is also central. Many secret societies focus not on external achievement, but on personal refinement. This inward orientation is less visible and therefore more easily misunderstood. In a culture that celebrates outward success, quiet self-improvement can seem suspicious or irrelevant. Freemasonry asks its members to look inward first, to consider how they act when no one is watching, to examine motives rather than appearances. This focus does not translate easily into public metrics. There are no trophies for patience, no headlines for restraint. And so, the value of this work often goes unnoticed by those outside the tradition. Fear enters the picture when secrecy is interpreted as concealment rather than containment. If something is private, the assumption arises that it must be hiding harm. This assumption says more about cultural anxiety than about the practice itself. Societies that value transparency above all else often struggle to accept that some experiences lose meaning when exposed fully to public view. Historically, periods of intense suspicion towards secret societies coincide with times of instability. When trust in institutions erodes, people search for hidden explanations. The existence of any private group becomes threatening. Freemasonry, due to its longevity and symbolism, becomes a convenient focus for this unease. Yet the psychology of conspiracy mirrors the psychology of initiation in an ironic way. Both promise access to deeper truth. Both create a sense of being in the know. The difference lies in direction. Freemasonry turns the gaze inward, asking members to refine themselves. Conspiracy thinking turns the gaze outward, searching for enemies and hidden manipulators. One calms the mind through structure and reflection. The other excites it through suspicion and urgency. This contrast helps explain why Freemasonry, when misunderstood, becomes fertile ground for conspiracy narratives. The same mechanisms that make ritual meaningful, mystery, symbolism, separation, can be repurposed by fear. Another psychological layer involves trust. Participation in any inner circle requires a willingness to trust others and to be trusted in return. This mutual trust builds slowly, reinforced by shared norms and expectations. In Freemasonry, trust is cultivated through repetition and familiarity, rather than emotional intensity. This slow-building trust contrasts sharply with the instant connections of modern life. Online communities form and dissolve rapidly. Belonging becomes transactional. In this context, the lodge feels anachronistic. It asks for patience. It asks for commitment. It asks people to show up regularly, even when nothing dramatic happens. For some, this feels deeply satisfying. For others, it feels inaccessible or unnecessary. Neither response is wrong. It reflects differing psychological needs. Freemasonry does not claim to be essential for everyone. It offers one way of engaging with meaning, not the way. This humility is often overlooked. Secret societies are frequently imagined as seeking influence or expansion. Freemasonry, in reality, has often struggled with declining membership and limited public interest. The persistence of the tradition suggests that it meets a need for some people, even if that need is not universal. It provides a framework for reflection that does not depend on belief in specific doctrines. It allows for difference within shared structure. This balance between individuality and belonging is psychologically delicate. Too much conformity stifles growth. Too much freedom dissolves cohesion. Secret societies attempt to navigate this tension by offering common symbols while allowing personal interpretation. The use of degrees reinforces this balance. Progress is acknowledged but not rushed. Recognition exists but is earned quietly. This counters the modern impulse toward immediate gratification. It teaches that growth unfolds over time. Another often overlooked aspect is how secret societies provide a safe space for vulnerability. Ritual creates distance from everyday identity. Within the lodge, individuals can step out of their public roles. They are not defined by their job titles or social status. This temporary anonymity allows for more honest self-reflection. In psychological terms, this is a form of containment. The ritual frame holds emotion and thought in a structured way. It allows individuals to explore questions of purpose and morality without feeling exposed. The closed nature of the space supports this process. When participants trust that their words and experiences remain within the group, they are more likely to engage sincerely. This trust is fragile and easily misunderstood by those who equate openness with virtue. Freemasonry's survival across centuries suggests that this model of meaning-making remains relevant, even as forms change. Humans continue to seek experiences that feel set apart, not to escape the world, but to return to it with greater clarity. In modern life, where boundaries blur and attention fragments, the appeal of such spaces may even increase. The lodge offers something rare: a pause, a rhythm, a reminder that not all value is visible. The human mind does not thrive on constant exposure and explanation. It needs moments of quiet, of anticipation, of reflection. Secret societies, when functioning ethically, provide these moments by design. Understanding Freemasonry through the psychological lens removes much of the drama. It becomes less a story of hidden power and more a story of human needs for belonging, structure, reflection, and meaning. These needs are not shameful or dangerous. They are fundamental. When unmet, they often surface in distorted forms: extremism, obsession, conspiracy. When met gently, they foster patience and self-awareness. Freemasonry represents one historical attempt to meet these needs through symbolism rather than ideology, through ritual rather than rhetoric. It does not claim perfection. It does not guarantee enlightenment. It offers a path, not a destination. As the mind settles into this understanding, the fear surrounding secret societies begins to soften. The closed door no longer feels threatening. It feels intentional, not a barrier to truth, but a threshold to experience. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson beneath it all, that not everything meaningful needs to be public, that some forms of understanding grow best in stillness, that the human search for meaning often leads inward through shared silence rather than outward through loud explanation. In the end, secret societies endure not because they control history, but because they speak to something timeless within us, a desire to slow down, to belong, and to shape ourselves with the same care that builders once shaped stone. Memory is a strange and patient thing. It does not preserve events as they were, but as they were felt. Over time, facts blur the edges, emotions sharpen or soften, and stories begin to drift away from their origins. What remains is not history in its pure form, but something layered, part truth, part interpretation, part longing. This is a space where myth is born, and it is in this space that Freemasonry has lived for centuries. Myth is often misunderstood as falsehood, but it is better understood as memory shaped by meaning. When people retell a story, they emphasize what feels important to them. Details that resonate survive. Others fall away. Over generations, this process creates narratives that may not align perfectly with facts, but reveal something deeper about collective fears, hopes, and values. Freemasonry, with its symbols, rituals, and long silence, became fertile ground for this process. Its history unfolded slowly, without a single founding moment or dramatic declaration. That very subtlety made it difficult to remember clearly. In the absence of a simple story, many stories emerged. Some remembered Freemasonry as a brotherhood of builders, preserving ancient knowledge through patience and craft. Others remembered it as a philosophical refuge, a quiet resistance to rigid authority. Still others remembered it as something darker, an unseen force shaping events from the margins. Each memory carried a different emotional weight, shaped less by evidence than by experience. Over time, these memories hardened into myths. Myths simplify. They take complexity and compress it into narrative. A long history of gradual evolution becomes a single origin story. A decentralized network becomes a unified power. Silence becomes intention. Ambiguity becomes design. These transformations are not malicious. They are natural. The human mind seeks coherence, even if it must create it. In periods of stability, myths tend to soften. They become stories told with curiosity rather than fear. In periods of upheaval, they sharpen. Anxiety searches for form, and myth provides it. Freemasonry's mythic shadow grew darkest during times of social tension, when institutions were questioned and trust eroded. It is no coincidence that the most extreme stories about Freemasonry emerged alongside revolutions, wars, and cultural shifts. When the world feels unpredictable, people look for hidden patterns. A secret society offers a ready explanation. Someone must be in control, even if that control is imagined. Yet myth is not sustained by fear alone. It is also sustained by fascination. Freemasonry touches something ancient in the human imagination, the idea of hidden knowledge passed quietly through generations. This idea appears in countless traditions, from mystery schools to sacred orders. It speaks to a desire for depth in a world that often feels shallow. The problem arises when myth replaces memory entirely. When symbolic stories are mistaken for literal truth, understanding collapses. Freemasonry becomes whatever the storyteller needs it to be: villain, savior, relic, or enigma. The real tradition, lived quietly by ordinary people, disappears behind the projection. Memory within Freemasonry itself is not immune to myth-making. Rituals preserve stories through symbolism, not chronology. They teach lessons, not timelines. Over time, even members can forget where metaphor ends and history begins. This is not deception. It is a natural consequence of transmitting meaning rather than data. Symbols encourage this blurring. A symbol does not anchor itself to a single interpretation. It invites reflection. Over generations, interpretations accumulate. What was once a practical teaching tool becomes layered with philosophical and emotional meaning. Memory deepens, but clarity can fade. This is where myth and memory intertwine most tightly. Memory keeps the shape of the past, but myth fills it with resonance. Together, they create something that feels true, even if it is not strictly factual. The danger is not myth itself, but forgetting that it is myth. When myth is treated as literal history, fear takes hold. People begin to defend or attack ideas that no longer correspond to reality. Freemasonry becomes frozen in a form that never truly existed, judged for actions it never took, praised or blamed for outcomes shaped by countless other forces. The quieter truth is less dramatic, but more instructive. Freemasonry's history is one of adaptation rather than design. Its symbols evolved. Its rituals shifted. Its membership changed. There was no master narrative guiding these changes, only human choices made in specific contexts. Memory, when approached gently, can recover this nuance. It reminds us that traditions are lived, not scripted. That meaning emerges through practice, not proclamation. That continuity does not require uniformity. In modern times, the tension between myth and memory has intensified. Digital media accelerates storytelling while flattening context. Images circulate without explanation. Claims spread faster than corrections. Myth thrives in this environment, untethered from evidence. At the same time, historical memory becomes harder to maintain. Nuance does not travel well in headlines. Long stories struggle to survive in short attention spans. Freemasonry, already misunderstood, becomes an easy canvas for projection. Yet memory persists in quieter ways. In personal stories shared within lodges. In archives preserved patiently. In rituals repeated not because they are mysterious, but because they feel grounding. These forms of memory do not compete with myth. They simply exist alongside it. For those willing to listen, this memory offers a different perspective. It reveals a tradition shaped by ordinary human concerns, belonging, integrity, continuity. It shows how myth grows not from deception, but from distance. Distance between insiders and outsiders, between past and present, between symbol and explanation. Bridging this distance requires patience. It requires letting go of the need for definitive answers. It asks us to accept that some questions remain open, not because they are forbidden, but because they are complex. There is a particular feeling that comes from passing a familiar place without stopping. A building you have walked by hundreds of times. A doorway that blends into the street, so completely that it barely registers. And yet, one evening, perhaps when the light is low and the city has softened its edges, you notice it, not because it has changed, but because you have. The door is closed. It always has been, There is no sign inviting you in, no explanation offered, just stone, wood, and a quiet suggestion of presence. You pause for a moment, not out of obligation, but curiosity. Then you continue on your way. This simple act, walking past the door, captures something essential about Freemasonry and about human attention itself. So much of what shapes us exists at the edges of awareness. We do not need to enter every space, solve every mystery, or uncover every story. Sometimes noticing is enough. Freemasonry has always existed like this in the background of daily life, not demanding attention, not asserting relevance. It has remained where it is, while the world has changed around it. People pass by without seeing it. Others glimpse it briefly and move on. A few feel drawn closer, not by urgency, but by resonance. The idea that there's a door we may choose not to open is strangely comforting. Modern life rarely offers this option. We are encouraged to click, to scroll, to investigate endlessly. Curiosity becomes compulsion. Silence becomes an invitation to fill space rather than to rest. But this door does not ask to be opened. It simply exists. To walk past it without anxiety is to accept that not all meaning belongs to us. Some traditions endure without our participation. Some paths are valid without being traveled. There is humility in recognizing that curiosity does not require consumption. For centuries, Freemasonry has been one of these quiet presences. It has not chased the attention of the many. It has waited for few who feel naturally inclined to pause. This waiting is not strategic. It is simply the result of a tradition built around patience rather than persuasion. Walking past the door, you might wonder what happens inside. You might imagine voices, symbols, candlelight, or you might feel nothing at all. Both responses are natural. The door does not judge curiosity or indifference. It offers no reward for speculation. What matters is a choice to keep walking without carrying the door with you, without turning it into obsession or fear, without needing it to mean something more than it does. This is where many misunderstandings begin. The mind dislikes unresolved questions. It wants closure. When a door remains closed, the imagination fills the space behind it. Stories form. Motives are assigned. The door becomes larger in the mind than it ever was in reality. But what if the door is simply a door? What if its closedness is not a challenge, but a boundary, not meant to provoke, but to protect a certain rhythm of experience from the constant gaze of explanation? In this sense, Freemasonry's quiet presence is a reminder of something easily forgotten, that not every tradition must be universal, that meaning can exist without broadcasting itself, that some forms of understanding are optional, not necessary. Walking past the door also mirrors the way we encounter most of history. We move alongside countless stories without entering them fully. We do not live every life, join every movement, or explore every belief system. And yet, these stories still shape the world we inhabit. The city itself is built this way. Layers upon layers of intention, labor, and memory surround us. We do not stop to decode every symbol carved into stone. We do not investigate the origins of every custom we inherit. We live among them, absorbing their presence without needing to master them. Freemasonry occupies a similar space. It is woven into cultural history, architecture, and language, yet it does not require our attention to function. It exists comfortably alongside indifference. There is freedom in this. The door does not represent exclusion so much as choice. Some will knock. Some will enter. Most will pass by and live full lives without ever thinking of it again. None of these paths are superior. This perspective softens the anxiety that often surrounds secrecy. A closed door does not automatically imply danger. It can simply mark a space that is not meant for everyone, not because of worth, but because of orientation. Just as not every person is drawn to music or mathematics or meditation, not every person is drawn to symbolic traditions. Interest cannot be forced without losing authenticity. Freemasonry has survived precisely because it has not tried. As you continue walking, the door fades back into the cityscape. Street lights hum. Footsteps echo. Life resumes its ordinary rhythm. And yet, something subtle remains. A sense that the world contains more layers than we usually notice. and that noticing them does not obligate us to act. This is a deeply restful realization. So much tension comes from belief that every mystery must be solved, every system decoded, every symbol explained. But history is not a puzzle waiting for completion. It is a landscape through which we move at our own pace. Freemasonry, viewed this way, becomes less a question and more a feature of that landscape, like a river you cross without knowing its source, like a mountain you see but never climb. Its presence enriches a view without demanding ascent. Walking past the door also invites reflection on how we relate to the unknown in general. Do we meet it with suspicion, with hunger, with fear, or can we meet it with calm acknowledgement? The answer matters less than the awareness. When we allow some doors to remain closed, we create space within ourselves. Space where imagination does not spiral. Space where curiosity can soften into appreciation. Space where the unknown becomes part of the world's texture rather than a problem to solve. This approach does not diminish learning. It refines it. It teaches discernment. It reminds us that depth is not measured by how much we uncover, but by how thoughtfully we engage with what we encounter.